This being a recorded speech, I have to respectfully recognize the protocol already established and to greet members of the Academy, the Vice Chancellor, I presume, and all distinguished guests and participants. I have been asked to reflect on the theme, Translating Thought into Action towards Decolonial Equity and Justice in the Caribbean. And in contemplating on this theme, two resonances from our prophets of resistance reverberated. The first is Bob Marley's Redemption Song, which asserts that we need to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, as none but ourselves can free our minds. And in this effort, we must have no fear for atomic energy, because none of them can stop the time. Latvia explores the theme of the inner plantation as the subjective expression of the harsh subordination of the plantation system, so aptly delineated in the works of Kamau Brafitt, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and the legendary George Beckford, and extracted this quotation from his work, which adequately describes, and I quote, the deeply pervasive ethos of internalized oppression cultivated by the material reality of plantation. And I quote, within plantation community, interpersonal relations reflected the authority structure of the plantation itself. It engenders an ethos of dependence and patronage, and so deprives people of dignity, security, and self-respect. And it impedes the material, social, and spiritual advance. Within plantation society, the tradition, values, beliefs, and attitudes which have become established as a result of long periods of plantation influence are for the most part inimical to development. End of quotation. The second is the battle cry of Peter Tosh, Equal Rights, in which he laments that while everyone is crying out for peace, no one is crying out for justice. And so he is insistent that we need equal rights and justice. An assertion echoed by Martin Luther King when he emphasized that, and I quote, peace is not simply the absence of conflict, but the existence of justice for all people. So in many ways, the theme of this year's conference is well framed by these two ideological cultural constructs. They admonish us that the fundamental challenge of our struggle is first and foremost the emancipation of the mind, because it is the liberation of thought that propels action. Philosophers of all ages and races have recognized the truth of this assertion. The German philosopher Wolfgang von Goethe recognized this when he said, and I quote, "None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe that they are free." End of quote. And although von Goethe was making this statement in 1809, it echoes through the tunnel of time, and to reinforce the reality that freedom is not bestowed by anyone, but first by the exercise of mental liberation as the subjective precursor to the exercise of freedom. And what has added poignancy to our theme is that Goethe's assertion reminds us of the dangers of false consciousness and the recognition that freedom is not just a mind thing, but also an action thing. We can't just think free, but we must live free. And that living free is not simply the capacity to exist in peace, but to live in an environment characterized by equity and fairness, to enjoy, according to Tosh, equal rights and justice. Reframed through these lenses, the essence of our theme is that freedom begins as a mental affirmation of our elemental humanity that must be translated and given material expression through our actions, which embody and demonstrate our sovereign identity. And in chronicling our long march to freedom, it is the undying flame, the impulse to emancipation from whatever shackles our potential that we must treasure, protect, and cultivate. The scars of our history and the pain of the experience cannot be undone or reversed, but they have also been the fire in which our resilience and fortitude have been forged. In that context, history matters, but we are challenged by our topic to see and understand history not as linear progression or simplistic causality, but as a layered, multidimensional construct. I believe that a serious discussion on decolonial equity and justice must embrace the thinking of our very own. The Guyanese writer Wilson Harris had a unique and complex conception of time that was expressed in his literary work. He believed that past, present, and future could coexist and intermingle, allowing for a non-linear understanding of time. In his novels, Harris frequently explored the idea of time as a circular or spiral construct where events and experiences are interconnected across different temporal planes. This approach allowed him to delve into themes of history, memory, and myth, blending them in a way that challenges conventional narratives. And for the exploration of our topic, the reconciliation of these thematics provides clues to a more sophisticated appreciation of the action required in the movement towards decolonial equity and justice. Harris's conception of time was also deeply influenced by his Caribbean background and the region, the history of colonialism and cultural fusion. He saw time as a medium through which the complexities of identity, history, and culture could be explored and reinterpreted. And this is highly relevant as it enables us to appreciate that the past is not linear past tense, but also shapes the present tense and sets the parameters of the future tense, all of which exist in the multidimensional vortex of time. So here is how simply this translates to the historical context of colonialism in our Caribbean and its impact on equity and justice. Winston Churchill, icon of the empire, pontificating to the Peel Commission inquiry into the Arab revolt in Palestine in 1937 said, and I quote, "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time. I do not admit that right. I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia. I do not admit that a wrong has been done to these people by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldwidely race, to put it that way, has come in and taken their place." End of quote. This perfidious statement is the quintessential summation of the colonial mindset. Ask yourself, what is the fundamental difference between this ideological perspective and the basic eugenic precepts of the Nazi regime, against whose aspirations to world domination so many of the world's red, black, and brown fought and died? Excised from memory are the forgotten colonial forces of World War II. India alone contributed 2.5 million troops, together with Africans, Arabs, Caribbeans. What we do know is that over 87,000 Indian troops and 3 million Indian civilians died to defend and uphold the hegemony of those who deem themselves, quote, a stronger, higher grade and more worldwidely race. The supreme historical irony of this statement is that Churchill's memorial in history as a hero of the free world stands on the pedestal of supreme sacrifice of the black, brown, red, and yellow races that he so contemptuously spurned. The purpose of my speech today is to advocate for actionable steps towards decolonial equity and justice in the Caribbean. This involves not only understanding our shared history of colonialism and its enduring impacts, but also identifying and implementing concrete strategies that can dismantle these legacies. We must explore policies, cultural initiatives, and community-driven efforts that aim to correct systemic inequalities and builds a society that truly reflects the diverse, rich heritage of the Caribbean. Our focus should be on transformative actions that can bring about real change in achieving equity and justice, grounded in a decolonial framework. And the process of decolonization is far from complete. We hear you, Bob Marley. None but ourselves can free our minds. We hear you, Apostle Tosh, that they are still crying out for peace, but not seeking justice. And we get it, Guth. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe that they are free. For clarity, let us begin our exploration of understanding decolonial equity and justice with an understanding of the conceptual lens I am wearing to view this challenge. We begin by acknowledging the rich and complex history of the Caribbean, a region shaped significantly by its colonial past. There is absolutely no need to go in an audience of this caliber to go into any detailed recounting of the legacy of slavery and colonialism and their deep and complex interrelationship. Suffice to say that there is a long, distinguished and unbroken tradition of Caribbean scholarship that has contributed to our understanding of their hitherto obscured reality and their profound impact on our contemporary subjective and objective condition. Among the most prominent of this constellation, spanning the 18th century to the present, would be persons like Fernando Ortiz of Cuba with his concept of transculturation, Aimé Césaire, Martinique, with his work on negritude, C.L.R. James of Trinidad and Tobago, Frantz Fanon, Martinique, with his work on the psychological impact of colonialism, Eric Williams, Trinidad and Tobago, with capitalism and slavery, Edouard Glissant, Martinique, Walter Rodney, Guyana, with his pivotal work on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, Antonio Benitez Rojo of Cuba, Maryse Condé of Guadeloupe, Hilary Beckles of Barbados with his path-breaking work on reparatory justice, Patrick Chamoiseau's notable works contributing to the Creolite movement, starting by gaining prominence in the 1980s and late 1990s, and Jamaica Kincaid of Martinique. This tradition of scholarship has made an immense contribution to the struggle for decolonial equity and justice. Decolonial equity is an approach that aims to undo the lingering effects of colonialism in societal structures, in cultural dynamics, and economic systems in the Caribbean. It involves recognizing and correcting the systemic inequalities rooted in colonialism, which have historically marginalized indigenous and Afro and Indo-Caribbean populations. Decolonial equity seeks to address and rectify the enduring impacts of this colonial history on the present and the future of Caribbean societies. Properly understood, these impacts demonstrate how the DNA of the past persists in the present and, unless altered, transmutes into the future. The insidious reality is that it is present but not always obvious, and like a virus, its genetic mutations may change its appearance to accommodate to new conditions, but not alter its fundamental nature. In this respect, Bob Marley was absolutely correct in admonishing us that we must emancipate ourselves from mental slavery, as none but ourselves can free our minds. Colonial legacies continue to manifest in various aspects of the lives of nations. Economic disparities, social inequalities, and cultural erasure or dominance are genealogically traceable to the disruptions of history, but the most pernicious effects of colonial legacies have been mental, institutional, and cultural. This was well demonstrated by the following statement by a high-ranking British official in the height of colonialism in the Bombay administration. And I quote, "The natives must either be kept down by a sense of our power, or they must willingly submit from a conviction that we are more wise, more just, more humane, and more anxious to improve their condition than any other rulers they could possibly have." End of quote. So we look now at the challenges and opportunities for translating thought into action. In short, the struggle for decolonial equity and justice is a struggle against hegemony, and in this battle, our challenges are also our opportunities. But what is paramount is the translation of thought into action. Fighting hegemony, especially in its cultural and ideological forms, involves a multifaceted approach that includes the following 9 strategies. 1. Raising awareness and education, because education plays a crucial role in challenging hegemonic norms and values. This involves not only formal education, but also public awareness campaigns, social media engagement, and community outreach programs. By educating people about the nature of hegemony and its impact on society, individuals and groups can become more critical of the status quo. At the core of this awareness project must be the reconstruction of citizenship, rebalancing rights and obligations, and establishing the sovereignty of the citizen beyond the 5 minutes every 5 years in the ballot box. On that note, there's a fascinating paper in SALISES Social and Economic Studies Journal of 2004, in which Lawrence Alfred Powell discusses the issue of equity theory, and I quote, "the cognitive maps that citizens use in making comparative judgments about the relative contributions, that is, inputs into the societal transaction, rewards, which is the outcomes from societal transaction, and needs of the different social groups in Jamaican society." End of quote. Traditionally, this analysis has been conducted via reductionist opinion surveys, but Powell has argued the necessity for a more multidimensional methodology that is better able to apprehend the multifaceted complexity of perceptions of social equity and justice. Recognition of this political reality enables us to be empirical and practical about the conduct of our politics within the constitutional paradigms bequeathed or imposed on us. Colonial equity and justice, as Powell reminds us, is important for the masses, as it will determine who gets what, when, and how. This equation cannot, in any serious development trajectory, continue to be determined by the political tribe to which you belong. And we also need to change the paradigm, as some of our African families are doing, from alleviating poverty to growing prosperity. The second one, promoting alternative narratives and perspectives, which involves challenging hegemony, requires the creation and the amplification of alternative narratives that counter the dominant ideologies. This can be achieved through various forms of media, literature, art, and academic research that provide different perspectives and challenge mainstream narratives. And we are not short of counter-hegemonic narratives. But the problem is that they are not given the space for critical scrutiny and democratic ventilation. There was a time in the era of the 70s and 80s when the academic voice, especially at UWI, was strong, collective, and strident, the New World Group, Tapia House, the forum groups in the OECS. It was a time when well-reasoned, empirically grounded alternatives were being presented and debated. As an almost infallible law of history, when hegemony begins to be questioned by the masses, conservative restoration kicks into full gear, to the extent, as we have seen happening at the global level, that democracy itself is threatened by the rise of the transnational right. Culture wars intensify, and truth is subverted. Which brings us to the third one, the importance of building coalitions and networks. Collaboration among diverse groups that are affected by or oppose hegemonic structures is essential. Building coalitions across different social, political, and cultural lines can create a stronger and more united front against dominant powers. The fourth, grassroots movement and activism. Grassroots movements are vital in mobilizing communities and initiating change from the bottom up. And activism can take many forms, including protests, community organizing, lobbying, which can all contribute to challenging and eventually changing hegemonic structures. The fifth, policy advocacy, legal challenges, and far-sighted policy. Engaging in policy advocacy and using legal systems to challenge unjust laws and practices can be effective in combating hegemony. This might involve lobbying for policy changes, participating in elections, or using the courts to challenge unjust practices. Contemporary history teaches us that it is possible for a society to achieve equity and justice. Both China and Rwanda stand out as historical examples that show the importance of public policy in changing society through the exercise of vision and by playing the long game. China, for example, has achieved remarkable progress in poverty reduction over the past 50 years, particularly since the economic reforms that began in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping. The GDP growth has averaged over 9% a year since then, leading to a significant improvement in the standard of living. More than 800 million people in China have been lifted out of poverty, a figure that represents almost 3/4 of the global reduction in extreme poverty during this period. By 2020, China had eliminated absolute poverty in World Bank terms. This achievement is considered historically unprecedented, both in terms of speed and scale. China's approach to poverty reduction was multifaceted. It involved broad-based economic transformation to open up new economic opportunities and raise average incomes. This transformation included increasing agricultural productivity, promoting industrialization, managing urbanization and rural to urban migration, and enhancing infrastructure development. Alongside this, targeted support was provided initially to disadvantaged areas and later to individual households, recognizing that some populations required specific assistance. Nearer to home and skin is the example of Rwanda's recovery following the devastating 1994 genocide. Under President Paul Kagame's leadership, Rwanda has undergone significant socioeconomic transformations. Since assuming office in 2020, Kagame has been credited Economic growth has averaged nearly 8% over the past 5 years, despite lacking the natural resources of its peers. This growth is a result of Kagame's economic development plan, which focuses on increasing agricultural productivity, boosting tourism, enhancing technological growth, and significant government spending on infrastructure. In agriculture, exports earnings from coffee grew significantly, with a cooperative that once earned around 20 cents per kilogram for a regular quality coffee in 2000, earning nearly $4 in 2013. Technology has played a significant role in Rwanda's transformation. Mobile penetration has surpassed 70%, and the government aims to provide high-speed internet access to 95% of Rwandans. Legal challenges are often underestimated, but a fair and transparent legal architecture is critical in setting the boundaries as well as opening the opportunities. I was astounded to hear recently from a learned legal friend that our very independence that we so cherish was granted by an act of the British Parliament and technically could be repealed by a succeeding act of that Parliament. That reality alone should speak clearly enough about the incompletion of the decolonization process and the imperative of our own declaration of definitive independence, as Barbados has done in becoming a republic. The sixth area, cultural resistance. Cultural resistance involves using art, music, literature, and other cultural forms to challenge dominant ideologies and values. This can be a powerful way to reach a wide audience and influence public opinion. The role of culture in the maintenance of hegemony is well established, but so too is the power of culture as a force for transformation and the deconstruction of domination and oppression. Ask our South African and other frontline state sisters and brothers about the contribution of the music of resistance, and especially the role of conscious reggae in the fight for their liberation. Seventh, critical discourse and dialogue. Encouraging open and critical discussions about hegemonic structures can foster a more informed and conscious society. Dialogue should aim to be inclusive, encouraging participation from diverse groups and perspectives. The eighth area, personal reflection and change. On an individual level, reflecting on one's own beliefs and behaviors, recognizing how they may perpetuate hegemony is crucial. Personal change can involve altering consumption habits, challenging one's own prejudices, and actively supporting marginalized groups. And lastly, international solidarity and support. The struggle against hegemony and a geopolitical and economic system designed by the powerful to extract from the weak requires international solidarity and support. This can involve supporting international organizations, participating in global movements, and advocating for policies that resist global hegemonic powers. Fighting hegemony is a complex process that requires sustained effort across various sectors of society. It is about changing both the structural aspects of society like laws and institutions and the cultural aspects like norms and ideologies. I want to end by thanking the organizers for inviting me to deliver this address, because preparing it presented the challenge and provided the opportunity for a fascinating journey in unraveling the ways in which the past persists in the present. I have also learned that the road to decolonial equity is a long one that requires deep surgery, not only in our socio-economic and political institutional architecture, but critically in our mental frames. And so the profundity of our cultural prophets, Mali and Tosh, in calling for us to emancipate ourselves from mental slavery and to fight for equal rights and justice as a prerequisite for peace could not be overemphasized. Until we achieve this transformation, we will remain as the prisoners of history, living the short and anxious lives that Seneca, the Roman Stoic, warned about when he said, "Life is very short and anxious for those who forget the past, neglect the present, and fear the future." Our historical mission is to dismantle the shackles of the past in the urgency of this present moment, so that we can, in the words of Edward Kamal Brafitt, shatter the door and enter the morning, fully aware of the future to come. But let me leave you with a question that I have not answered. How are we going to stimulate our youth to take up that mantle and light the flame that our succeeding generations can carry to complete this historical mission? Frantz Fanon did advise us that, and I quote, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. End of quote. We, this generation, know the mission. Are we fulfilling it or betraying it? I thank you for your indulgence.